I'd like to welcome everyone to the webinar series of the Cybersecurity and Information Systems Information Analysis Center, CSIAC. Today's presentation is an update on current FDA cybersecurity efforts. My name is Steve Warzala. I am the CSIAC Outreach Manager. A few administrative notes before we begin. First, all phones have been muted except for the presenters. Questions may be asked at any time during the presentation by utilizing the chat function. And time permitting, your questions will be answered at the end of the session. The briefing slides will be posted on our website within a couple of days, along with a recording of the webinar. And finally, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank our sponsor, the Defense Technical Information Center, DTIC. The funding that DTIC provides enables CSIAC to conduct these webinars. It's my pleasure to introduce our presenter for today's webinar, Ms. Jessica Wilkerson. She is a cyber policy advisor with the All Hazards Readiness Response in Cybersecurity, or the ARC team, in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health within the Food and Drug Administration. As part of the ARC, Jessica examines issues and develops policy related to the safety and effectiveness of connected medical devices. Previously, she worked as the Cybersecurity Research Director for the Linux Foundation and spent over 5 years as a congressional staffer with the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, covering cybersecurity issues in the telecommunications, commercial energy, and health sectors. In that capacity, she examined issues related to coordinated vulnerability disclosure, software supply chain transparency, legacy technology risks, and cybersecurity governance models. I will now turn the presentation over to Ms. Wilkerson. Good afternoon, Jessica. The floor is now yours.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all for being here today. As Steve mentioned, I am here to talk about FDA's current cybersecurity efforts. But I'm actually going to take a step back and start us off with a more basic question. And that is a duplicate slide. This is the question that I'm going to start us off with. Why is the Food and Drug Administration involved in cybersecurity at all? We are the Food and Drug Administration. We deal with food. We deal with drugs. We deal with devices. This is a question that thankfully I've been getting asked less and less as time goes on, but it's one that comes up every now and then, and I do think it's important to sort of outline. So, why is the Food and Drug Administration involved in cybersecurity? Because we are responsible for ensuring that medical devices are designed to provide reasonable assurances of safety and effectiveness before they may be marketed to patients and consumers. And when it comes to modern medical devices, that means it's a patient safety issue. Cybersecurity is a patient safety issue. And I'll be going through this in a little bit more detail, or some of the specific efforts that we have, but pausing here for a moment to just talk about this conceptually, I think it makes a lot of sense. We have seen through news reporting where medical devices that are connected have had cybersecurity vulnerabilities. We've seen instances where hospitals are experiencing ransomware infections and some of the medical devices are being impacted. All of these things can have patient safety impacts. And it's not just the obvious, right? There's always the quintessential Homeland example for any of those of you who have seen the TV show Homeland and have seen the episode with the vice president's pacemaker being hacked. That's always there, sitting out there, that there might be a direct patient safety impact from a medical device that's impacted by a cybersecurity issue. But something that gets think about a little bit less, but is equally important, is what happens if a patient just can't receive care because the medical device isn't available? What happens if they need an MRI, if they need a CT scan, but the CT scanner or the MRI machine is locked out because of ransomware? What if the EHRs aren't available because there was a ransomware infection at a hospital? And maybe that had something to do with the medical device, maybe it didn't. But the fact of the matter is, medical devices today are heavily connected when it comes to the internet and other advanced technologies. And and they sit in hospital and other healthcare delivery organization networks. And that makes those devices' ability to protect themselves and protect their functionality from cybersecurity threats a patient safety issue. So cybersecurity is a huge priority for FDA. It's a huge issue that we work on. That it's all I work on. That's precisely why I was hired to the FDA. It's pretty much all I do day in and day out, is make sure that we are doing everything that we can as an agency to ensure that patient safety is being considered by ensuring that cybersecurity is being considered in the development, the deployment, and the maintenance of medical devices. So let's get into it. How is the FDA working to improve medical device cybersecurity? Our primary method for this is these documents called guidances. And for those of you who aren't necessarily directly familiar with the FDA, this may be a little bit of an unfamiliar concept. We have to do a lot of myth busting around what a guidance is and what it isn't. So FDA has statutory authority to regulate medical devices. We were told by Congress, we were given legal authority by Congress to regulate medical devices. So we have, that right. We have that responsibility. But regulations tend to be very, very high level. You're not going to go pull up the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act regulations or even the Code of Federal Regulations, the things that implement them, and be able to figure out, okay, here's what I need to do from a cybersecurity perspective to make sure that I'm meeting these regulations. But that's not what they're for. And so when it comes to ensuring that FDA stakeholders, and this is across the board, this is not just medical device manufacturers, these are drug manufacturers and others as well who fall under FDA purview, in order to help guide them, literally guide them, in order to meet our regulations, FDA essentially puts out these documents that says, here's how FDA recommends you meet our guidances. Some of them can be very high level, some of them can be detailed, but it's our way of helping industry. It's sort of this partnership effort with the guidances to ensure that we are making it as straightforward as possible for our stakeholders to meet the regulations and our requirements. One important thing to notice here, and this is where some of this myth busting comes in, and I'll come back to this in a second. Medical device manufacturers may choose alternative measures if they can demonstrate that their procedures, their policies, whatever, are as effective as those things outlined in the guidances, that what they choose to do instead of what we recommend will still meet the regulations. However, most manufacturers do choose to comply with the recommendations provided in FDA guidances. And so the myth that I really quickly wanted to highlight and then immediately bust while we're on this page is sometimes people, especially with respect to FDA cybersecurity guidances, they say, oh, these are voluntary. Oh, you don't actually have to comply with any of these. FDA doesn't actually have any cybersecurity regulations. That's not true. Cybersecurity is built into our regulations itself because cybersecurity, again, is a patient safety issue. So to meet risk evaluation criteria, to meet design and development criteria, to meet all of these things that are in the regulations, but at that very high level, that all includes the cybersecurity elements. But again, the guidances are there to help manufacturers figure out how to do that, given how complicated cybersecurity is as a topic. So cybersecurity is required under FDA regulations. I don't want anyone to leave here doubting that. Even if you are hearing this thing about, oh, well, FDA's guidances are voluntary and you don't have to do them. That's technically true, except that you do still have to meet cybersecurity. So one way or the other, through the mechanisms that manufacturers choose themselves or through compliance with guidances, you got to have cybersecurity in your products because it's a patient safety issue. So let's talk a little bit about some of the guidances that we do have out. It's a pretty picture of some of the ones. The Premarket Guidance that came out in 2014 is sort of what folks normally cite as the start or the beginning of FDA's really dedicated specific efforts on cybersecurity. Like I said, cybersecurity had always and already been part of the regulations, but this was our first real effort to encapsulate them into a specific guidance and put that together and put it out for industry's use. And for that reason, it was very high level. It was essentially just an acknowledgement of what we've been talking about, that you've always had to address cybersecurity in your products if they had cybersecurity concerns, even before the 2014 Premarket Guidance. What this did was, one, acknowledge that straight up so that there was no question that that was true. But it also created a framework for essentially saying cybersecurity is a huge concern. It's a growing concern. It's going to continue to be. The 2014 pre-market was essentially targeted at creating a process, a framework that could grow as the industry grew. So cybersecurity is a constantly evolving concept, not only for industry who's trying to design cybersecure, cybersafe medical devices, but for the agency as we deal with them, as we review them, as we make sure that they, again, have that reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. We have to be able to evolve with the industry, with cybersecurity concerns. Excuse me, there goes my voice. We have to make sure that we can keep up with them. Industry has to be able to keep up with them. We have to be able to evolve with the cybersecurity threats. And that's what this 2014 pre-market guidance did, is it provided us that framework. What came next was the 2016 post-market guidance. And let me actually back up because I'm now realizing I don't think I've explained sort of the difference between pre and post-market. It's conceptually what it sounds like. Pre-market is what you have to do as a medical device manufacturer to get your device approved to actually go on the market. So there are different categories of medical devices. They're class 1, class 2, and class 3. I'm not going to go into this in any great detail, but for some categories of devices, you have to get what's called pre-market approval before you can legally market them in the United States. So that pre-market phase is what we're talking about when we say pre-market. Post-market is also exactly what it sounds like. What happens or what you need to do after your device has gone on the market, because your responsibilities and medical device manufacturers' responsibilities doesn't end once they've got pre-market approval and have actually managed to put a device on the market. They have other things that they need to continue doing. And so this post-market guidance specifically around cybersecurity is one of those things. And I'm actually very quickly just going to grab a water bottle. So sorry, everyone. So let's talk about post-market guidance, coordinated disclosure. This is probably something most of you are familiar with because coordinated disclosure is something that's been around in the IT sector for a long time. My apologies, I don't know what's happening here with my throat, but anyway. But the basic idea is cybersecurity systems today, cybersecurity, the devices we rely on, whether they're medical devices, ICS devices, or just computers or the phones that we use, they're massively complicated. And we have an entire community, a very robust, very vibrant, very smart community who they like to go and they like to go poke around systems and they like to figure out, does the system have a vulnerability? Is there a flaw here? They have many different motivations, and that's a conversation for a different day, or I think actually later in this talk. But the point is, what we've seen in the medical device sector in particular, as third parties approaching medical device manufacturers, essentially telling them, we have information for you. We found a flaw in your product. We want to tell you about it so that you can fix it, so that there is less of a risk of patient harm, and we want to work with you to make it better. And right around the time this post-market guidance was coming out, there had been this whole string of post-market cybersecurity vulnerabilities found in medical devices. Some of them were in drug infusion pumps. Some of them were in pacemakers. But the point was, nobody really knew what to do about it in the medical device sector. This was something that had existed in other sectors, but not ours, and we needed to figure out what to do about it. We as the agency needed to know what to do. The manufacturers needed to know what to do, and we wanted to help the independent third parties who could be companies or who could just be individuals who, were just hobbyists or whatever the case may be. We needed to help them understand what they needed to do. And so this post-market guidance, one of the biggest components that came out of this is exactly that. What do we do with third-party research? Well, what we did, one of the biggest things that we did was encourage it. And so the big thing for FDA, this is how I used to phrase it when I was with Congress, but it's also, I think, the way that FDA certainly looks at it, is you should accept free help. If somebody is coming to you and bringing you information on a problem with your product, you should work with them. You should accept that information. You should make it as easy as possible for them to do that, because it's going to make your product better. It's going to increase the probability that a problem is fixed before it actually creates a problem in the market. Can actually lead to, for us, patient harm. So what we did was we took, if you look on the screen, it says this Part 806 reporting enforcement discretion. Part of FDA's regulations essentially says, if there is a patient injury, there's a serious patient injury or patient death because of a medical device, the medical device manufacturer is required to tell us about it. You have to tell FDA. You can voluntarily tell us anything, but that's voluntary. But if this patient death or serious injury happens, you have to tell us. And there's other things that waterfall from that. So what the enforcement discretion provided was it essentially said, if you can demonstrate certain categorizations of the vulnerability, that the risk is what we consider controlled, uncontrolled versus controlled is an FDA term of art when it comes to vulnerabilities. Happy to talk about that more if folks want. But if you can demonstrate that, if you can provide a fix within a specific time frame specified in the guidance, and you're a member of an information sharing and analysis center or organization, among a couple of other things. And again, if this is relevant to you for whatever reason, check the guidance. Please don't take my remarks here as gospel. But it's essentially said, you might not have to do a recall, or you might not have to do some of these other FDA things that you ordinarily would have if you didn't have this discretion. And the whole point of that was to encourage coordinated disclosure, which we really do see as critical for FDA's, the ability of FDA to respond to cybersecurity concerns and for manufacturers to respond to cybersecurity concerns. The other big thing that came out of the 2016 Postmarket Guidance was trying to switch the mentality for cybersecurity vulnerabilities in particular, looking at cybersecurity risk as being a function of severity, the potential severity of an incident where it's to be exploited, and the exploitability itself. So how easy is it to create this issue? How easy is it to create this impact? Which is not necessarily the way that the medical device sector in particular, looks at issues. So this was a little bit of a mentality change specifically with respect to cybersecurity. The other big thing that we did want to take, again, for those of you who are familiar with medical devices, is this total product life cycle approach to things. And I'll talk about this a little bit later. But the basic idea being, if we are seeing cybersecurity vulnerabilities in the post-market, probably there are similar, or in some cases, the exact same issues in the pre-market. So essentially, if we were seeing issues come up in post-market, what we were doing was ensuring that those lessons learned were getting transferred back to the folks at FDA who are responsible for doing product reviews, pre-market product reviews. Apologies, trying to make sure everyone doesn't have to listen to me cough. That those lessons learned are getting put into the pre-market so that we're correcting those issues before they actually manage to get onto the market at all. We're going back to manufacturers and saying, okay, we've noticed that there is this similar problem in your device versus this issue that we've seen in the post-market. Before you get pre-market approval, you need to do something about this. So that was a pretty big deal for the 2016 post-market. Then we're now up to 2018 with the draft pre-market. So this is, again, going back to the original 2014 pre-market. This was our proposed update. So what happened with the 2018 version is this is not a finalized guidance. This is draft. We put this out and we requested comment. And boy, did we get comments. So, we are now in the process, just so everyone is aware, of taking these comments back and updating our draft pre-market guidance with respect to the comments and other lessons learned we've figured out since 2018, and we're going to be putting out another draft. I'm waiting for somebody to ask me when it is, when to expect it, but I won't steal your thunder if somebody wants to ask me when to expect that. What the 2018 pre-market draft guidance did essentially was focus on a couple of the same things. So one, again, that total product life cycle that If we're seeing things in post-market, then we need to be transferring them to lessons learned in pre-market. Things that we're learning in pre-market, to the extent that they're applicable to post, need to be transferred as well. The other big thing that was in the 2018 draft pre-market that some of you may be familiar with and that FDA considers to be a huge deal is cybersecurity bill of materials. Many of you are probably more familiar with this as software bill of materials, but when we put it into the 2018 draft pre-market, it was a little bit broader. When we said cybersecurity bill of materials, we meant everything. It was going to be the software, it was going to be the hardware, it was going to be any of it that was relevant. And we got a lot of feedback on this. And as part of that feedback, we've actually been participating in, I guess you can call them SBOM exploratory, partnerships and groups and things. And so the biggest one, for those of you who have participated or who know of it, is the National Telecommunications Information Administration's software transparency process, which is essentially the NTIA SBOM process. Is SBOM a good idea? Yes, no. The answer is yes. And, if SBOM is a good idea and we need to do it, how? Because we don't necessarily have formats. We don't necessarily have data schemas. We don't necessarily know how to operationalize the idea of an SBOM. Or at least when this NTIA process started, we didn't. I think that that's materially changed, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more about SBOM if people think that that's something that they want to hear about. The 2018 draft pre-market also focused a lot more on this idea of building security in rather than trying to bolt it on later. So I know I myself tend to be very snarky about cybersecurity solutions where the mitigation to the vulnerability is just slap a firewall in front of it and we're done. What we are pushing manufacturers to see in our sector is you need to be building the device so that the security is already there. So that putting firewalls up, putting these things outside of the device around it to layer around it to protect it is good, and you're going to have to do that too. But the device itself should have the most robust cybersecurity capabilities that it possibly can. And so the draft pre-market focused on that. It focused on an increased ability for security testing. Part of that being, it's one thing to test a device in a perfectly controlled environment, a clean room essentially. It's another thing to stick it in a healthcare environment where it's going to be used by people who aren't cybersecurity experts. We're going to be used in situations where, that possibly weren't anticipated by the designers and all of these things, and tested security capabilities then. So it talked a little bit more about security testing. It also acknowledged something that I think that we as cybersecurity professionals are sometimes liable to forget, which is that cybersecurity is not solely an IT issue. Yes, you need to have your security controls in place. Yes, your device needs to be designed well. But you also have to have the structures in the organization in place so that, for example, if there is a cybersecurity issue that's discovered, that issue can be elevated up to senior levels of management and that can be dealt with. It's not something that gets shoved aside as, less of a priority or something that's going to cost the organization money with very little return on investment. That cybersecurity is an organizational priority that gets treated like one. And so, the draft pre-market also runs through some of that about how your organization needs to be handling some of those elements. All right, I think we're good on the guidances. Let's see. We are. I'm going to drink some more water, and then we're going to talk about cybersecurity vulnerabilities. So as you can see here, I pulled out 3 of the biggest vulnerabilities that we've had to respond to as an agency. The first one that you can see here is St. Jude. I don't know if any of you were familiar with or experienced or just sort of watched the Muddy Waters St. Jude disclosure that happened a few years ago. But this was the issue where essentially a stock short seller was informed of vulnerabilities by a security research company, shorted the company's stock, and then revealed publicly that there was an issue that, where pacemakers could, quote unquote, be hacked. Obviously, the situation was a little bit more nuanced, but, it was still problematic. We still had to deal with the fact that these pacemakers had a very serious cybersecurity vulnerability. Another one that some of you may be familiar with is Urgent 11. That happened in October. Oh my gosh, I guess it was a year ago. That had a pretty big, pretty widespread impact across a whole host of devices. And then recently, in March, right at the beginning of the pandemic, the timing could not have been better, was something called Swain-Tooth. And this essentially was a Bluetooth low energy vulnerability that was pretty bad. The thing is, we have many medical devices these days that do leverage Bluetooth and Bluetooth low energy, so this was something that we need to respond to. But how do we do that? How does FDA respond to cybersecurity vulnerabilities? So I think I touched on this a little bit in going through some of the guidances, but FDA's responsibility for assuring reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness of medical devices doesn't stop when the medical device goes on the market. Just like manufacturers are responsible for keeping track of it after it's in the market, we're responsible for ensuring that it remains safe and effective once it's there. So if an issue, cybersecurity or otherwise, and I always think it's important to point out, that this all exists in the non-cybersecurity context too. If there's just an issue with the physical design of the device, many of these things would be relevant as well. But if there is a cybersecurity issue, we have things that we do. We evaluate the risk of the patient harm. We collaborate with other appropriate parties to figure out what the fix may be. In a lot of cases, this involves working with whoever brought us the vulnerability. Is that a third-party security researcher? Was it another government agency? Was it the manufacturer themselves? Whoever found it, we'll work with them. We'll work with them on that. We'll work with the manufacturer of the product. Oftentimes, we'll work with other federal agencies like the Department of Homeland Security to figure out what the fix might be, and to also figure out, what's the timeline for disclosure? Because, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but FDA is also very cognizant of the fact that many of these devices are with patients. Many of these devices are things that patients rely upon. And so, patients need to be made aware. So the goal is always to figure out how do we inform the public of these vulnerabilities, but how do we do that in a way that we don't introduce more risk, if we don't introduce more potential for exploit. So one of the ways that FDA in particular does this is through what are called safety communications. These are a pretty big deal. As you can see, we don't use them for everything. But this is essentially when we need to tell the public that there is a cybersecurity vulnerability that may not be well known, the fixes may not be available, all of these kinds of things. Safety communications are essentially a big blinking red light from FDA that you being caregivers, patients, medical device manufacturers, hospitals, whoever, need to be paying attention to this. We put one out for Swain-Tooth back in March. We put one out for Urgent 11 back last October. And sometimes we put them out for individual products, as you can see here. And then you can also visit this website down here if you want to go look at a list of all of the ones we've put out. But let's talk about other FDA initiatives. One of the big ones, and for those of you who aren't necessarily completely familiar with the way that FDA works, this might not be totally meaningful to you, but the reviewers, the people who actually look at what are called pre-market submissions, the packages of information that manufacturers give us when they're trying to get their device approved, that review, all of those reviewers sit in an office called OPAC, the Office of Product Evaluation and Quality. OPAC has stood up something called the Cybersecurity Focal Point Program, and the whole idea is we need reviewers who are specifically trained and who focus on cybersecurity, on how to be not only a medical device reviewer, but how to be able to do medical device reviews with cybersecurity in mind. So that's what the Focal Point Program does. They also participate in response efforts when what we call cross-cutting cybersecurity vulnerabilities are found. So Bluetooth is in all sorts of devices, not just in vitro devices or implantable devices or big heavy machines like MRIs or things like that. They can be in all kinds of things. And so the focal points are really helpful for us at FDA to be able to respond to those kind of cross-cutting vulnerabilities because they have that cross-cutting expertise. They also ensure that, they are providing input and feedback on agency policies with respect to cybersecurity. So I'm a cyber policy advisor. That's mostly what I do is I design policy for the agency with respect to medical device cybersecurity. One of my big things that I do, I make sure that the policies that I am recommending that we are working on reflect what the reviewers think we need to do. If they're the ones who have, hands-on the reviewers, the submissions from the manufacturers, their thoughts, their experiences, their expertise on, what we need to do to be better at reviewing devices for cybersecurity concerns is very important to make sure is, included in all of our policy work. So, the focal point program is very important for me and for the other policy folks at FDA in terms of ensuring that, again, sort of that total product life cycle, that total agency efforts with respect to cybersecurity is met. Another one that I'm going to mention relatively briefly is just threat modeling. Some of you may have actually participated in this, I don't know. But FDA has funded through two organizations, through MITRE and through the Medical Device Innovation Consortium, MDIC, to do two things related to threat modeling. To host boot camps to train medical device manufacturers and others in how to do threat modeling. And then subsequent to that, there's going to be a playbook developed that essentially outlines, how to do threat modeling in the medical device sector. And we believe that this is incredibly important. Threat modeling as a concept is incredibly important within the medical device sector because, as I'm sure everyone listening to this knows, modern information systems are just so unbelievably massively complex. They can range from having a dozen individual nodes to having hundreds of thousands. And the way that they interconnect, the businesses that are involved, the devices that are there, the protocols that they're using, the cybersecurity that they incorporate, all of these things can materially change the attack surface of a given system, of a given device. And, in order to ensure that medical device manufacturers and others are appropriately considering cybersecurity risk and dealing with it, you have to be able to, think comprehensively about what threats might be facing it and how to respond to them. And that's exactly what threat modeling is. And so that's why FDA has funded these boot camps and this playbook. The playbook isn't out yet, just let me highlight that, but it will be forthcoming. So let's very briefly, or possibly not very briefly, talk about how we work with other partners when it comes to medical device cybersecurity. But first, let's talk about why we work with other parties when it comes to cybersecurity. Well, it's pretty conceptually obvious, right? You don't really have a connected system unless you have a connection. So if I'm just sitting at home on my laptop and it's not connected to the internet and it's not connected to anything and it's never been connected to the internet and it's never going to be connected to the internet, cybersecurity might be less of a concern. It's certainly going to be less of a concern in the way that we typically worry about it. So the defining feature, like it says here on this slide, is that modern information systems are connected. That's the whole point. They're linking up governments, they're linking up businesses to individuals and to each other through the computers and the phones and the devices that we're all using. But the connectedness is the defining feature. And what that means is cybersecurity is a shared responsibility. FDA cannot assure the cybersecurity of the medical device sector on its own. We can be as competent as we want. We can be as good at our jobs as we want. We're never going to be able to do it. We have to have the help of the medical device manufacturers. We have to have the help of the hospitals and healthcare delivery organizations that use and rely on medical devices. We have to work with patients. We have to work with doctors. We have to work with anyone and everyone who's relevant to this conversation. That's the only way that we're really going to be able to effectively address cybersecurity. So one of the big ones that we work with, and again, this might be one that's not familiar to folks who don't work regularly with the medical device sector, is the IMDRF, the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. And one of the reasons why the IMDRF relationship is so critical, not just to the FDA, but to the medical device sector generally, is cybersecurity is a global issue. I have yet to meet or hear about a cybersecurity threat that respects cybersecurity borders. I guess there are those very clever pieces of malware. Sometimes, they don't activate in certain countries or things, but as a general rule, cybersecurity threats do not respect national or other traditional borders. The internet tends not to. And so in order to be effective at really addressing cybersecurity threats and in assuring patient safety when it comes to cybersecurity, FDA has to work with international partners. And we do. I mean, we participate in this IMDRF forum to do exactly that. And the IMDRF works on all kinds of issues, like FDA. They don't just oversee cybersecurity concerns, they oversee all kinds. But recently, very recently, the IMDRF stood up a specific group to look at medical device cybersecurity from the international context. And FDA actually code-led this. So this was a task group underneath the IMDRF that FDA led. And it was focused on, FDA has its national level guidances. IMDRF put together an international level guidance when it comes to cybersecurity. And that is this document right here. So this was what was released in March 18th of 2020. So it's a relatively recent document, but it includes many of the things that we've already talked about during this presentation. It talks about coordinated disclosure. It talks about vulnerability management. It talks about, we'll get to legacy devices in a bit. It's important enough that I gave it its own slide. But the key factor here, especially for medical device manufacturers who work on a global scale, who don't just sell their products within the United States, is there's alignment between the different international regulators on what the expectation should be when it comes to cybersecurity in medical devices. And so this work is actually continuing. We are going to continue to work with the IMDRF to try and put some additional context and some additional, quote unquote, meat on the bones of this guidance. But, for those of you who this is relevant to you, or who, you think is interesting, I would highly recommend checking out the IMDRF guidance. I'm not biased at all, but I think it's a fantastic document. And then another big one is other government agencies. So one of the things that, I don't know if this is also a myth that I would consider that needs busting. But another thing that we deal with on a pretty regular basis as FDA are concerns from parties who wonder why we're not doing more to ensure cybersecurity of hospital networks. So, we obviously, FDA has been very forward-leaning about medical device cybersecurity, but, we don't talk about the security of hospital networks necessarily or related things like that. And there's a reason for that. We are not the regulator who's in charge of that. And so when it comes to things like security of hospital networks, when it comes to things like security of billing systems and things like that, those are the responsibilities of other healthcare regulatory entities like HHS, OCR, ONC, CMS. So we work with them on a regular basis to ensure that all parts of the healthcare sector are addressing cybersecurity, and that what we're doing is, it's a whole of government approach to ensuring healthcare cybersecurity overall. So we also work with state, local, and tribal level agencies. So we just, it runs the full gamut. We also, of course, work with things like the Department of Homeland Security. I had already mentioned that. With the FBI when it comes to some of the law enforcement angles of cybersecurity incidents like this. And so the bottom line is, in the same way that cybersecurity threats don't respect national borders, as much as we may wish they did, cybersecurity threats don't respect divisions of authority and responsibility between regulatory agencies. And so we all have to make sure that we're, working together, singing from the same sheet of paper, I think is the term. When it comes to these kinds of efforts, and that's how we make sure that we do this in an effective way. Another big one is the private sector, and I'm going to hit on this a little bit more because I'm going to come back to two specific task groups that we're participating in underneath this. But the private sector as a whole is just indispensable to FDA's work because, I can't remember exactly what the percentage is, but a lot of what is known as critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector. And so in order to protect that critical infrastructure, we have to work with the private sector because it's not ours. It's not our systems. They're not our devices. And so we have to have this very robust partnership with them in order to make sure that these things are being addressed, that, cybersecurity concerns are being met. And so we do. We work with something called the Healthcare Sector Coordinating Council, which is the official public-private partnership body underneath U.S. law. We're not the only ones who have one. There's an Energy Sector Coordinating Council. There's a Financial Services Sector Coordinating Council. But these councils are incredibly important because they just allow for this partnership and alignment between the private sector and the federal government. We also, of course, work with information sharing and analysis centers and information sharing and analysis organizations with respect to sharing information about current cybersecurity threats, about vulnerabilities, things like that, to ensure that because cybersecurity threats move so fast, that we are aware of things that we need to be aware of if the information is coming in through the private sector, or when we become aware of information that the private sector needs to be aware of, that we're sharing it back out. So these relationships are critical to how we do modern cybersecurity response. I'm going to take a moment here just to talk about individual manufacturers. I know this might not be fully relevant to some of you because you're not medical device manufacturers. You don't specifically work with the FDA on regulatory issues like pre-market review. But one thing that I think is very key to the way that FDA approaches medical device cybersecurity is we do it in a very collaborative way. And this is including with the manufacturers who are trying to get pre-market submissions themselves. And so we have made this process where manufacturers can essentially come to us before their submissions are even officially submitted to ask questions about their cybersecurity controls. Is this good enough? Do we need to be doing something else? What about this? What about that? That makes the process better for everyone involved. We've also another big one, and this is a huge one that I'm gonna highlight because when I talk about myth busting, this is one that comes up all the time. You generally, for most routine cybersecurity updates, kind of imagine when you update your computer or when you update your phone to the new version of the operating system. Most routine cybersecurity updates do not require pre-market approval. You don't have to go through the approval process again in order to do it, which is something that's been a point of confusion over the past couple of years. We are trying to lessen that confusion to the greatest degree possible because, it's critical, again, with how fast cybersecurity threats move, that cybersecurity updates are available to be applied as quickly as possible. So we have, again, we try as best we can to collaborate to the greatest degree possible with medical device manufacturers to make our pre-market submission process better, to make the post-market relationship better, to just ensure that medical devices, again, are as safe and effective as possible. One that I do need to spend some time on is our patients, of course. So, the mission of the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, CDRH, which is the specific division that I work for, is to protect and promote the public health. One of the biggest pieces is ensuring that patients and providers have timely and continued access to safe, effective, and high-quality medical devices and radiation-emitting products. So patients are a huge part of this, and sometimes, they aren't talked about as much because it usually is between FDA and the manufacturers and the hospitals as sort of the biggest elephants in the room. But we can't ever lose sight of why we're doing this. We're doing this to make healthcare better. And so FDA makes sure to get the patient perspective as often as possible as we're doing our various work. We do this through a specific program that we have within the FDA. So the Patient Science and Engagement Program has various mechanisms for talking to patients, for soliciting their recommendations and their advice. We also do this through something called the Patient Engagement and Advisory Committee. So this committee is exactly what it sounds like. It is a committee of patients, entirely made up of patients, who advise the FDA on several different issues. I mean, it doesn't have to be cybersecurity related, but they help us understand from a patient perspective, patients who, again, and this is an important point to highlight, may not be cybersecurity expert themselves. What do they think needs to be done for medical device cybersecurity? What do they think is important that FDA do, that manufacturers do, that hospitals do? And so we use the peak and the public meetings that we have to figure that information out. So last year's September 2019 peak meeting was on communications. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. And then we actually have the next peak meeting in 2 days on artificial intelligence and machine learning. So we're looking forward to that. You know what? I'm actually going to skip this slide because I think we talked about independent security researchers earlier. I mean, the biggest component here is that independent security researchers, independent security third parties who are coming to manufacturers and presenting them information on their products are critically important in the healthcare sector. We want medical device manufacturers and other parts of the healthcare sector to be working with them. We expect that, and we work with them. We work with them so much that, we show up at cybersecurity conferences like DEF CON, and we participate in things like the Biohacking Village. We work with the hacking community, the quote-unquote hacking community, with things like We Heart Hackers, for those of you who are aware of it. We have as robust as possible a relationship with these researchers because they have proven themselves, and they really have proven themselves to be so critical to healthcare cybersecurity overall. Let's see. My slide didn't change. Okay, so there are two, like I said earlier, there are two specific issues that I wanted to highlight. One of them is on legacy devices, and one of them is on vulnerability communications. The latter one, I'll just say now, is related to that peak meeting. So the September 2019 peak meeting that had involved the communications to patients. We took the findings, we took the requests from that, and actually set up a specific task group for it, or are participating in a task group for it. So I'm going to talk about that after I talk about the legacy device issue. But starting with, what is the legacy device issue? It's exactly what it sounds like. We are all familiar with sort of this idea that because of the way that cybersecurity networks or information security networks have developed, oh, did I just get booted? I'm back. I think I'm back. Okay.
Yep, we got you.
Hi, everyone. Again, let's continue talking about legacy devices. But actually, it's like the platform was conspiring to prove my point. Sometimes legacy devices and information technology doesn't work the way that we want it to. Sometimes it's too old to do what we want it to. Sometimes it's too old to secure. And that's really the legacy device issue, is that, there are devices out there that can't be updated to be protected from current cybersecurity threats. There are devices out there that are still in use that still are able to do exactly what they're supposed to do. Maybe it's an MRI machine, and it still does perfectly good scans, but it's not very cyber secure. And so we, as an agency, we as a sector have recognized that we need to do something about this. And one of the things that FDA has decided to do is going back to that council that I had mentioned earlier, the Healthcare Sector Coordinating Council. We are co-leading a task group specifically underneath that group, underneath the council, to look at these issues. So you can see the charter here on the slide, but the basic idea is legacy devices are a known problem throughout the sector. They're not only a known problem, but they're a known cybersecurity problem, and we need to do something about them. We need to figure out how to get them out of hospital networks without bankrupting hospitals. We need to figure out how to design better devices so that they don't become legacy so fast. And this task group, which has been working kind of since the beginning of the pandemic, is currently, looking at all of these things and how do we do exactly those kinds. And so the goal is to have that task group efforts finished here, within not too long, and then to present what we come up with to the public so that, not only FDA or medical device manufacturers or hospitals or the other participants of the task group itself, but everyone can benefit from our findings, and we can figure out, what do we do next. The other issue that I did want to mention is the one from the peak meeting, which is, is vulnerability communications. And so this one is the idea that, in the past, cybersecurity vulnerability bulletins, advisories, whatever it was, they were primarily meant for cybersecurity professionals, right? They were going to be taken by somebody who understood cybersecurity, and they were going to be dealt with in that way. They were not meant for lay people. They were not meant for patients. And so they're not written to be comprehensible to lay people and to patients. They're filled with all kinds of technical jargon. They're filled with, these little assumptions, and that people are going to know how to read the acronyms. They're going to know how to do some of the mitigation steps that are recommended within them. And the fact of the matter is today, vulnerability communications are read by all kinds of people. They're read by patients. They're read by the FDA. They're read by reporters. They're read by whoever. And the fact that they're so impenetrable sometimes creates real problems. Even setting aside, what it means for the FDA or reporters or manufacturers or hospitals or whatever, if a patient is handed a medical device cybersecurity advisory and they don't know how to read it, they don't know what it's telling them to do, how can they realistically be expected to address the potential risks to their health? And so, this is something that the FDA has recognized both on its own and as part of the peak meeting. This was something that the patients, as part of that advisory committee, told us. And it's also something that the private sector has recognized. And so there's another task group that FDA is also co-chairing underneath the Healthcare Sector Coordinating Council, looking specifically at these issues. How do we do vulnerability communications better so they're actually more useful for a broader array of audiences that include lay people, that include patients? And I think actually, anyway, yeah, so we'll just quickly move through this so we can have time for a few questions at least. FDA is going to continue evolving our cybersecurity approach as cybersecurity threats continue to evolve. We're going to do this because cybersecurity is a patient safety issue. If you take nothing away from this talk other than that cybersecurity is a patient safety issue, I have not wasted the last hour. So, that's our main driver. That's going to continue to be our main driver, and it's going to be what really guides us forward. I'm going to have a question slide, but I'm also just going to really quickly skip over. If you are a medical device manufacturer listening to this talk, you probably already know about the QSub process. But you can also feel free to email either of these two emails that are listed here to get in touch with appropriate FDA staff who can help answer questions on policy, on reviews, and so on and so forth. We highly encourage you to take advantage of this process if it's relevant to you, because it's to your benefit, it's to our benefit, and that means it's to the sector's benefit. So anyway, let's go back to questions. And I will turn it over to Steve and the crew to sort of guide us through that process.
Okay, thank you, Jessica, for that very informative presentation. So we do have a few questions from our attendees today. So let's jump into those. So first, one individual is wondering if there are any specific standards that companies should adhere to, and in particular, is wondering if the FDA might be considering adopting the DoD's cybersecurity maturity model certification, the CMMC model. Any thoughts there?
So standards are a little bit outside of my wheelhouse. I know that there are specific, I think they're called consensus standards, that essentially they get recognized by the FDA as being particularly applicable or being particularly good, whatever it is. I just can't name any of them off the top of my head. It's entirely possible. One of the ones that I would look at, if this is relevant to you, actually email one of those two email addresses, and I will, we will in some way get you to the right people to get you those answers. But I would look at something called the Joint Security Plan, which is like an FDA-specific guide that includes some standards information. And then there's also a benchmarking project that was just announced. So if you are a medical device manufacturer interested in, some of this, check out the MDIC's website, look specifically for the benchmarking project. It may be relevant to your interests.
Okay, thanks. I just advanced the slide because one of the questions, one of the individuals wanted those email addresses, and he didn't have a chance to write them down fast enough. So I wanted to help him out there.
Thank you for the assist.
Sure thing. So there was the question about the CMMC, and so there's a kind of related topic. So they're wondering if the FDA has a concept like the authorization to operate. It's the ATO. So that's a DoD process, and once again, kind of similar, wondering if there's an overlap between the DoD processes like the CMMC. That's pretty much brand new right now. That's coming out right now. So any relation there with the CMMC and how the FDA process works?
I'm not sure, and I don't want to speak out of turn. I think the only thing that I would say is the closest thing that we would probably come to an authorization to operate, specifically because, for example, FDA doesn't authorize hospital networks to go live or whatever. That's outside of our process. The closest thing that we'd probably come to is that pre-market approval for medical devices. So you essentially get authorization to market from the FDA through that process. That might be as close as we come. I'm sorry, I'm not sure otherwise.
No, that's fine. That's thanks for taking a crack at it. So let's see. Another individual was wondering, does the FDA include disclosure of sensitive patient information, PHI? Do you consider that a form of patient harm?
Yeah, so it can be. One of the things about the way that FDA approaches the cybersecurity reviews is they tend to be pretty case-by-case specific. And so, it's a little bit hard to point to exact situations and say, like, yes, this is a harm, no, this isn't a harm. But generally speaking, when it comes to the CIA triad, confidentiality, integrity, availability, we do adhere to that, or we do bring that in conceptually to our guidance and to our work. And so confidentiality is part of the calculus that we perform and that we work with manufacturers on.
Okay, thank you. And see, so another question had to do with the FDA threat modeling playbook, and then also the FDA Premarket Guidance. And so was inquiring about the relationship, the connection between those two. Is there a relationship between those two?
Yes. So I think we are still working on the next update to the pre-market guidance, what will be, the 20 at this point, the 2021, not the 2020 guidance update. Threat modeling will be something that gets considered, and it's for exactly the reasons that I had talked about a little bit earlier. Threat modeling is just a critical part of modern cybersecurity best practices. So I would expect threat modeling to be a part of what FDA wants to see from manufacturers in the future. Okay, great, thank you. So we had a question. So folks were wondering that situations where like a hospital has been hit with a ransomware attack. Now, is there a requirement for them to disclose that information to the public? Does a hospital have an obligation to disclose that, or can they just try to keep that under wraps? Sure. So this is getting outside of FDA's bailiwick. That actually falls underneath Office of Civil Rights regulations. And so instead of trying to put words in OCR's mouth, I would encourage everyone to go look for information specifically from the Office of Civil Rights. I will say generally, many other parts of HHS like FDA favors public disclosure of relevant information when it comes to cybersecurity. And so, I'll leave it at that because I'm not OCR, but go check out Office of Civil Rights information on that to get specific guidance.
Okay, great. Thank you. And so we're just right about at the end of our time. So I want to take a minute just to mention our November webinar. And that's going to be, it's scheduled for the 17th of November at 1 p.m. And we're going to have Dr. Kamal Jabbour. He is the Senior Scientist for Information Assurance. He's with the Air Force Research Laboratory Information Directorate. And he's going to be talking about cyber monitoring. So that'll be coming up in the middle of November. And so Jessica, I want to thank you for taking the time to share the information, your expertise with us today. It was a very informative presentation, and we thank you for doing the presentation for us today.
Well, thank you all so much for your attendance. I hope you learned quite a bit. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks a lot, everybody, and we hope to see you at our next webinar. You have a good day now. Thank you, and goodbye.